She controlled 5 kingdoms without ever wearing a crown. Her weapon wasn't an army, it was a wedding dress. Contessa Isabella Morvanti turned marriage into murder, and by the time her enemies realized the pattern, their sons were already saying "I do" to her daughters. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you in the comments. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all corners of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background, and let's begin our journey together tonight. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Valdonia like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their hold on the city that had dominated the Italian peninsula for 3 centuries. From the hills surrounding the metropolis, the marble palazzos appeared as gleaming jewels against the pewter sky, their towers piercing the clouds like monuments to human ambition. The merchants who worked the busy squares below had grown accustomed to the sight of wealth and power. Yet there was something about the Morvanti Palazzo that unsettled them in ways they could never quite articulate. Contessa Isabella Morvanti stood at the tall windows of her family's ancestral home, her dark eyes scanning the city that sprawled beneath her like a chessboard, waiting for the next move. At 32, she possessed the kind of beauty that had launched 1,000 political alliances, raven black hair that cascaded past her shoulders, olive skin that seemed to glow with inner warmth, and eyes that held depth suggesting intelligence far beyond what most men expected from women of her station. Yet it was not her beauty that made powerful men nervous in her presence, it was the calculating precision with which she observed everything around her. The palazzo itself reflected its mistress's refined tastes and strategic mind. Where other noble houses displayed their wealth through ostentatious gold and garish decorations, the Morvanti residence demonstrated power through subtlety and sophistication. Persian rugs covered floors of imported marble, while tapestries depicting scenes of classical mythology adorned walls that had witnessed centuries of political maneuvering. Every piece of furniture, every work of art, every architectural detail had been chosen not merely for beauty but for the message it conveyed about the family's status and capabilities. This morning, however, Isabella's attention was focused not on the trappings of wealth, but on the 5 young women who sat in the palazzo's sunlit garden, each absorbed in activities that would have appeared innocent to casual observers. Her daughters, Luciana, Bianca, Valentina, Serafina, and the youngest, Caterina, ranged in age from 16 to 24. And each had inherited different aspects of their mother's remarkable presence. Together they represented the most powerful unmarried women in the Italian peninsula, a fact that had not escaped the attention of ambitious families throughout the region. Luciana, the eldest at 24, possessed her mother's keen intelligence combined with a grace that made even hardened diplomats stumble over their words. Her auburn hair caught the morning light as she practiced her lute, but Isabella knew that beneath the musical performance lay a mind capable of memorizing genealogies, analyzing political alliances, and identifying weaknesses in seemingly impregnable family structures. She had been educated not just in the arts appropriate to noble ladies, but in languages, mathematics, and the subtle sciences of influence and persuasion. Bianca, 2 years younger, had inherited the family's talent for reading people's true intentions beneath their spoken words. While she appeared to be sketching the garden's flowers, she was actually studying the servants who moved through the courtyard, cataloging their loyalties, their fears, and their potential usefulness in future schemes. Her artistic talents were genuine, but they served as perfect cover for observation and analysis that would have impressed the most experienced spy masters. 20-year-old Valentina combined physical beauty with an intuitive understanding of human psychology that made her irresistible to men who believed they were manipulating her. Her apparently innocent conversations with visitors to the palazzo actually served as intensive intelligence-gathering sessions, during which she extracted information about family secrets, financial vulnerabilities, and personal weaknesses that could be exploited when circumstances required. She laughed easily and often, but those who knew her well understood that her amusement often came from recognizing how completely her targets underestimated her capabilities. Serafina, 18 and possessed of an almost ethereal beauty, specialized in appearing fragile and vulnerable while actually being the most ruthless of Isabella's daughters. Her talent lay in inspiring protective instincts in powerful men, leading them to reveal their plans, their fears, and their strategies in misguided attempts to shield her from the harsh realities of political life. She had learned to weep on command, to appear frightened by developments she had actually orchestrated, and to seem grateful for protection she neither needed nor desired. The youngest, 16-year-old Katerina, was still developing her particular talents, but already showed promise of surpassing even her remarkable sisters in the arts of deception and manipulation. Unlike her siblings, who relied primarily on beauty and charm, Katerina possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate her opponent's moves and counter them before they were even fully formed. Isabella watched her youngest daughter with particular interest, recognizing in her a potential successor who might someday surpass even her own achievements. The garden where the sisters spent their morning hours had been designed as much for strategic purposes as aesthetic ones. Its layout provided multiple vantage points for observing visitors, hidden alcoves for private conversations, and carefully planned sightlines that allowed the family to monitor approaches to the palazzo from several directions. The flowers and fountains were beautiful, but they also served practical functions in a household where information was more valuable than gold and trust was a luxury that could prove fatal. Isabella's contemplation of her daughter's development was interrupted by the arrival of her chief advisor, Marco Santini, whose family had served the Morvantis for 3 generations. His approach was announced by the soft footfalls that she had learned to recognize despite the thick carpets that muffled most sounds within the palazzo. When he spoke, his voice carried the deference appropriate to his station, but also the familiarity of someone who had earned his mistress's confidence through years of faithful and competent service. The information he brought confirmed what Isabella had suspected for several weeks. Her late husband's death had created a power vacuum that rival families were moving quickly to fill. Without Count Alessandro's political connections and military alliances, the Morvanti family's influence was diminishing daily, their wealth and property becoming increasingly vulnerable to aggressive neighbors who had waited years for such an opportunity. The traditional mourning period that followed a noble's death had provided temporary protection, but that grace period was rapidly approaching its end. Most widows in Isabella's position would have sought protection through remarriage to another powerful man, accepting a subordinate role in exchange for security. Others might have attempted to preserve their family's status through careful diplomacy and strategic concessions to more powerful neighbors. But Isabella had spent the months following her husband's death developing a far more ambitious strategy, one that would not merely preserve the Morvanti family's position, but expand it beyond anything previously achieved by their ancestors. The plan she had conceived was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Rather than seeking protection from powerful families, she would systematically eliminate them, using her daughters as weapons more devastating than any army. Each girl would be married to the heir of a major rival house, creating alliances that appeared beneficial to both sides. But these marriages would prove fatal to the husbands and devastating to their families, as carefully orchestrated accidents and illnesses cleared the way for Morvanti control of their wealth and territory. The beauty of this strategy lay in its use of society's expectations about women in marriage. Noble families routinely sought advantageous matches for their sons, viewing marriage as an opportunity to acquire allies, expand influence, and secure valuable dowries. None would suspect that the beautiful, accomplished Morvanti daughters were actually trained assassins whose weapons were charm, intelligence, and access to subtle poisons that could mimic natural deaths. By the time any patterns became apparent, it would be too late to prevent the consolidation of power that would make the Morvanti family untouchable. Isabella had spent months identifying the most suitable targets for her daughter's talents. The Montecroce family controlled the lucrative trade routes through the northern mountains. their wealth built on generations of careful commerce and strategic alliances. The de la Torres commanded the loyalty of influential mercenary companies, whose services were essential for maintaining order in the turbulent city-states. The Rossellas had married into papal nobility, providing access to the Vatican's political machinery and financial resources. Each target family possessed strengths that would complement the Morvanti holdings, while presenting vulnerabilities that could be exploited through carefully planned marriages. More importantly, each had sons of appropriate age and temperament to appeal to Isabella's daughters, men whose pride and ambition would blind them to the dangers of becoming too closely involved with the most dangerous family in Italy. The first phase of Isabella's campaign would focus on the Montecroce family, whose vast wealth and political connections made them both the most valuable target and the most dangerous opponent. Their eldest son, Marco Montecroce, was 26 years old and had recently inherited his father's business interests, along with expectations that he would soon make an advantageous marriage to consolidate the family's power. He was known to be intelligent, ambitious, and susceptible to beautiful women, qualities that made him perfect for Luciana's particular talents. As Isabella reviewed the intelligence that Marco Santini had gathered about the Montecroce family's current activities, she felt the familiar thrill that came with launching a complex strategy. Every detail had been planned with meticulous care, every contingency anticipated and prepared for. The letters that would initiate contact between the families had already been drafted, their tone perfectly calibrated to suggest mutual benefit while concealing the predatory intentions that motivated their creation. The approach would begin subtly, with casual mentions of the Morvanti daughters' accomplishments reaching Montecroce ears through apparently independent sources. Isabella had cultivated relationships with influential women throughout Valdonia's social hierarchy, creating a network of allies who could spread information and shape opinions without revealing their coordination with her objectives. These women would speak admiringly of Luciana's musical talents, her linguistic skills, and her remarkable beauty, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that would make Marco Montecroce eager to make her acquaintance. Once initial interest had been established, Isabella would arrange seemingly accidental encounters between Luciana and Marco at social events, cultural gatherings, and religious ceremonies where their interaction would appear natural and unforced. Luciana had been trained to make powerful men feel that they were pursuing her rather than being pursued, a psychological technique that appealed to masculine pride while ensuring that her targets invested emotionally in relationships that they believed they had initiated. The seduction phase would unfold over several months, allowing time for genuine emotional attachment to develop while providing opportunities for Luciana to study her target's personality, habits, and vulnerabilities. She would learn his favorite foods, his daily routines, his business practices, and most importantly, his fears and ambitions. This intelligence would prove crucial during later phases of the operation, when intimate knowledge could mean the difference between success and discovery. Throughout this courtship period, Isabella would be conducting parallel intelligence operations against the entire Montecroce family, identifying key individuals whose removal would facilitate her ultimate objectives. Family retainers whose loyalty might prove problematic, business partners whose opposition could complicate the transfer of assets, political allies whose intervention might disrupt carefully laid plans. All would be cataloged and assessed for potential elimination through methods that would appear unrelated to the primary operation. The wedding itself would serve as both celebration and trap, a public declaration of alliance that would actually mark the beginning of the Montecroce family's destruction. Isabella had already begun planning the ceremony's details, ensuring that every aspect would serve her strategic purposes, while maintaining the appearance of traditional noble matrimony. The guest list would include individuals whose presence would provide alibis and witnesses. The menu would feature dishes that could conceal subtle toxins, and the entertainment would create opportunities for private conversations that could advance her broader objectives. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the palazzo's garden, Isabella called her daughters inside for their daily briefing session. These meetings, disguised as simple family conversations, actually served as intensive training sessions where each girl reported on her observations, received instruction in advanced manipulation techniques, and practiced the skills that would prove essential to their mother's grand strategy. The sisters had grown accustomed to these sessions, understanding that their family's survival and prosperity depended on their ability to execute plans that required precision, patience, and absolute commitment to their shared objectives. The transformation of the Morvanti daughters from noble ladies into instruments of political warfare had been accomplished through years of careful education that combined traditional feminine accomplishments with decidedly non-traditional skills. They had learned to dance and sing, but also to detect lies and exploit psychological weaknesses. They could discuss poetry and philosophy with equal facility as they demonstrated knowledge of anatomy and toxicology. Their education had prepared them not just to be wives and mothers, but to be weapons in a war where survival demanded the complete destruction of one's enemies. As Isabella reviewed the final preparations for approaching the Montecroce family, she felt a deep satisfaction at how perfectly every element of her plan had fallen into place. The morning's intelligence confirmed that Marco Montecroce was indeed seeking a wife, that his family was open to strategic alliances, and that their current political position made them vulnerable to the kind of infiltration that Luciana specialized in. The timing was perfect, the target was suitable, and her daughter was ready to begin the campaign that would establish the Morvanti family as the dominant power in Italian politics. The palazzo fell quiet as evening descended over Valdonia, but Isabella remained at her desk, reviewing documents and correspondence that would initiate the most ambitious scheme in her family's long history. Tomorrow, the first letters would be sent, the first seeds planted, the first moves made in a game where victory would mean absolute power and defeat would mean extinction. She had prepared for this moment throughout the months of mourning, and now the time for action had finally arrived. In her private study, surrounded by maps of the Italian peninsula and genealogical charts that traced the bloodlines of every important family, Isabella Morvanti smiled as she sealed the letter that would begin Marco Montecroce's courtship of death. The game was about to begin, and she intended to win it completely. The letter arrived at the Montecroce Palazzo on a crisp October morning, carried by a messenger whose livery bore the subtle elegance that marked all things associated with the Morvanti family. The parchment was of the finest quality, sealed with wax that caught the morning light like a ruby, and addressed in script so perfect it might have been crafted by the angels themselves. Yet for all its beauty, this document carried within its carefully chosen words the seeds of destruction that would consume one of Valdonia's most powerful family. Marco Montecroce received the correspondence in his private study, a chamber lined with ledgers that chronicled 3 generations of commercial success and political maneuvering. At 26, he had inherited not only his father's vast trading empire, but also the expectation that he would expand the family's influence through strategic marriage and careful diplomacy. His dark hair and strong features had made him one of the most sought-after bachelors in the Italian peninsula, yet he had remained unmarried, waiting for an alliance that would truly elevate the Montecroce name to new heights of power and prestige. The letter from Contessa Isabella Morvanti appeared to offer exactly such an opportunity. Written with diplomatic precision and maternal warmth, it spoke of the friendship that had existed between their families in previous generations, and expressed hope that such bonds might be renewed in the present day. The Contessa mentioned, with appropriate modesty, that her eldest daughter Luciana had recently completed her education and was now of an age where suitable companionship might be considered. The suggestion was subtle, respectful, and completely irresistible to a man who prided himself on recognizing advantageous opportunities.
What Marco could not have known was that Isabella had spent weeks crafting this seemingly spontaneous correspondence, analyzing his psychology through reports provided by servants, merchants, and social contacts who had observed his behavior in various circumstances. She understood that his pride required him to believe that he was making independent decisions, that his ambition made him susceptible to possibilities for advancement, and that his relative inexperience with truly dangerous women left him vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation techniques that Luciana had been practicing since childhood.
The response that Marco penned that same afternoon played directly into Isabella's expectations, expressing gratitude for her thoughtfulness and indicating his interest in renewing the family's traditional friendship. He suggested that perhaps a social gathering might provide appropriate opportunity for such renewal, mentioning his own appreciation for music and cultural pursuits that might appeal to a young lady of refined education. His tone struck exactly the balance between confidence and deference that Isabella had anticipated, confirming her assessment that he would prove both eager and manageable throughout the courtship phase of her plan. Within days of this initial exchange, the elaborate machinery of Valdonian society began moving in directions that appeared natural, but had actually been orchestrated with surgical precision. Lady Francesca Albrizzi, whose salon attracted the most influential cultural figures in the city, happened to mention that she was planning an evening of musical entertainment that would feature some of the region's most accomplished young performers. The Montecroce family received an invitation that seemed to rise from their established position in society, while Luciana Morvanti was invited to perform based on her reputation as a musician of exceptional talent and grace. The evening itself unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance, with every participant unknowingly playing roles that Isabella had assigned them months earlier. The salon's elegant atmosphere provided the perfect backdrop for Luciana's debut in Marco's presence, while the musical program offered opportunities for conversation that would appear casual while actually serving her strategic purposes. She had prepared for this encounter with the thoroughness of a military commander planning a crucial battle, studying not only Marco's known preferences but also the psychological techniques that would make their interaction memorable and significant. Luciana's performance that evening transcended mere entertainment, becoming a demonstration of accomplishments that went far beyond what most noble families provided their daughters. She played the lute with technical mastery that impressed the assembled musicians, sang in 3 languages with perfect pronunciation and emotional depth, and displayed knowledge of musical theory that suggested education typically reserved for professional performers. Yet she delivered these demonstrations with such natural grace and apparent modesty that her audience felt they were witnessing spontaneous brilliance rather than carefully rehearsed presentation. Marco found himself captivated, not only by Luciana's obvious talents, but by the intelligence that sparkled in her dark eyes and the wit that flavored her conversation during the evening's social portions. She seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts about music, trade, and the political developments that shaped their world, asking questions that revealed both curiosity and understanding of complex issues. Her attention was flattering without being obvious, her interest apparent without seeming calculated, and her beauty enhanced rather than overshadowed by accomplishments that suggested depths waiting to be explored. What Marco could not have perceived was that every aspect of Luciana's behavior had been planned to create exactly the impression she achieved. Her questions were designed to make him feel intelligent and important while actually gathering information about his business practices, political connections, and personal habits that would prove crucial during later phases of the operation. Her apparent interest in his thoughts served the dual purpose of flattering his ego and studying his personality for weaknesses that could be exploited when circumstances required more direct manipulation. The weeks that followed their initial meeting saw a courtship that appeared to develop naturally through the accepted social channels of Valdonian aristocracy. Marco began appearing at events where Luciana was present, initially claiming coincidence but gradually making his interest more apparent through the subtle gestures that marked serious courtship intentions. He sent flowers with carefully chosen meanings, requested private conversations during chaperoned visits, and eventually approached Isabella with formal expressions of his desire to court her daughter with honorable intentions. Throughout this period, Luciana maintained perfect balance between encouragement and restraint, making Marco feel that he was winning her affections through his own efforts while actually guiding his emotions toward the complete devotion that her plans required. She shared carefully selected personal thoughts that created intimacy without revealing anything of significance about her true nature or objectives. She accepted his gifts with appreciation that seemed genuine while mentally cataloging the information they provided about his resources and contacts. Most importantly, she began the gradual process of making herself indispensable to his emotional well-being, creating dependency that would prove crucial during the marriage phase of Isabella's strategy. Isabella observed these developments with the satisfaction of a chess master watching an opponent make exactly the moves that had been anticipated and prepared for. Her intelligence network provided detailed reports on Marco's state of mind, confirming that he was becoming emotionally invested in the relationship while remaining completely unaware of the true nature of the woman who was capturing his heart. His business associates noted his improved mood and increased confidence, attributing these changes to the positive influence of a woman who seemed to bring out his best qualities. The formal betrothal announcement came in the spring, following a courtship period that had lasted precisely long enough to satisfy social expectations, while avoiding the delays that might allow Marco's family to conduct the thorough investigation that could have revealed inconsistencies in Isabella's carefully constructed persona. The engagement celebration was held at the Morvanti Palazzo, providing Isabella with the opportunity to demonstrate her family's wealth and sophistication, while studying the Montecroce family dynamics with the intensity of an enemy general surveying opposing forces. During the betrothal festivities, Isabella met Marco's parents, siblings, and closest advisors, mentally cataloging each individual's personality, loyalties, and potential usefulness in her broader plans. She identified family members whose removal would facilitate the transfer of assets, retainers whose continued loyalty might prove problematic, and political allies whose opposition could complicate her objectives. Each conversation provided intelligence that would inform decisions about which individuals could be preserved, and which would require elimination through methods that would appear unrelated to her primary operation. The wedding preparations consumed the summer months, providing Isabella with extended opportunities to infiltrate Montecroce family operations and establish the foundation for her post-wedding strategies. Under the pretense of coordinating between the families, she gained access to financial records, business correspondence, and political arrangements that revealed the full scope of Montecroce wealth and influence. This intelligence confirmed her initial assessment that Marco's family controlled resources, valuable enough to justify the risks involved in her elaborate scheme. More importantly, the preparation period allowed Luciana to complete her study of Marco's personal habits, daily routines, and physical vulnerabilities. She learned his preferred foods and beverages, identified the servants he trusted most completely, and mapped the private spaces where he spent his most relaxed and unguarded moments. This knowledge would prove essential when the time came to implement the methods that would transform her loving husband into her first victim. The wedding ceremony itself was a masterpiece of deception, presenting the appearance of joyful celebration while actually serving as the opening move in a deadly game that would conclude with the complete destruction of the Montecroce family. The guest list included individuals whose presence would provide alibis for events that had not yet occurred. The ceremonial elements incorporated traditions that would facilitate future activity, and the celebration feast featured dishes that had been selected as much for their ability to mask certain flavors as for their culinary excellence. Isabella watched the ceremony with emotions that combined maternal pride with predatory satisfaction. Luciana looked radiant in her wedding gown, every inch the loving bride that Marco believed he was marrying. The young man's obvious happiness and genuine affection for his new wife would have touched the heart of any observer who did not understand the true nature of the woman who had just promised to love, honor, and cherish him until death did them part. The newlyweds' honeymoon period was spent at the Montecroce family's country estate, a sprawling villa that provided privacy for the intimate conversations through which Luciana gathered the final pieces of intelligence needed to complete her mission. Marco, deeply in love and convinced that he had married the perfect woman, shared family secrets, business strategies, and personal fears with the openness that comes from complete trust. Each revelation provided Luciana with additional weapons that could be used to destroy the very foundations of his family's power. During these weeks of apparent marital bliss, Luciana also began the subtle process of introducing changes to Marco's diet and daily routine, that would prepare his body for the toxins that would eventually claim his life. The modifications were so gradual and seemingly insignificant that even a physician would have difficulty detecting their effects, yet they systematically weakened his natural resistance to the exotic poisons that Isabella had been acquiring through her network of foreign contacts. The first signs of Marco's mysterious illness appeared in late autumn, initially manifesting as fatigue and occasional digestive discomfort that could easily be attributed to the stresses of managing his expanded business responsibilities and adjusting to married life. Luciana played the concerned wife perfectly, expressing worry about his health while actually monitoring the progression of symptoms that indicated her preparations were achieving their intended effects. She suggested consultations with physicians, recommended rest and dietary modifications, and demonstrated the loving care that made everyone admire her devotion to her husband's welfare. As Marco's condition gradually worsened, Luciana's performance became even more convincing. Her apparent distress at his suffering moving even cynical observers to sympathy for the young bride whose happiness seemed threatened by forces beyond her control. She spent hours at his bedside, preparing special foods that she claimed might restore his strength, consulting with physicians about treatments that might arrest his decline, and praying publicly for his recovery with the fervor of someone whose world was collapsing around her. The toxins that were slowly destroying Marco's system had been chosen not only for their lethal efficiency, but for their ability to produce symptoms that mimicked various natural diseases, making diagnosis virtually impossible for the medical knowledge of the era. His physicians proposed different theories about his condition, prescribed treatments that provided temporary relief, followed by renewed deterioration, and eventually admitted their inability to identify the cause of an illness that seemed to defy conventional understanding. Marco's death came on a cold winter morning, following a night during which his suffering had finally overwhelmed his weakened body's ability to continue fighting the invisible enemy that had been consuming him for months. Luciana was alone with him during his final hours, tenderly holding his hand and whispering words of love that carried genuine emotion despite the calculated nature of her actions. Her tears were real, though they flowed not from grief but from the complex mixture of triumph and regret that comes from successfully completing a mission that had required intimate betrayal. The funeral was a grand affair that drew mourners from throughout the Italian peninsula, all coming to pay respects to a young man whose promise had been cut short by mysterious illness. Luciana's grief appeared so profound that even hardened cynics found themselves moved by her obvious devotion to her late husband's memory. She wore black with elegant simplicity, spoke of Marco with loving reverence, and conducted herself with the dignity that marked her as a woman of exceptional character facing tragedy with remarkable strength. What the mourners could not have known was that Luciana's apparent devastation served multiple strategic purposes beyond maintaining her cover as the innocent victim of cruel fate. Her public suffering established her as a sympathetic figure worthy of protection and support. Her obvious need for comfort made powerful men eager to offer assistance that could be exploited for intelligence gathering, and her status as a wealthy young widow opened doors that would have remained closed to a married woman seeking to advance her family's interests. The reading of Marco's will revealed the complete success of Isabella's strategy, as the document left virtually everything to his beloved wife, with only token bequests to other family members and charitable institutions. The wealth that had taken 3 generations to accumulate was now controlled by a woman who had been married into the family for less than a year, yet whose obvious love for her late husband made it impossible for anyone to question the appropriateness of his final decisions. More importantly, Marco's death had created power vacuums throughout the Montecroce business empire that could be filled by individuals loyal to Isabella's objectives. Key positions were quietly assumed by people whose qualifications seemed impressive, but whose true loyalty lay with the Morvanti family. Contracts and agreements that had benefited Montecroce interests were renegotiated to favor Isabella's expanding network of allies and subordinates. Within months of the funeral, the Montecroce name remained on business documents and property deeds, but the actual control had passed to Isabella through her daughter's inheritance. The success of the first phase exceeded even Isabella's optimistic projections, confirming her belief that the strategy could be replicated against other target families with equal effectiveness. The intelligence gathered during Luciana's marriage had revealed additional opportunities for expansion, identified potential threats that would require elimination, and demonstrated the complete viability of using marriage as a weapon for acquiring power and wealth through methods that left no evidence of wrongdoing. As winter gave way to spring, Isabella began preparing for the second phase of her campaign, studying the intelligence reports that would determine which of her remaining daughters would be matched against which target family. The Della Torre family appeared particularly vulnerable to Bianca's specific talents, while the Rossellis presented challenges that might be perfectly suited to Valentina's psychological expertise. Each potential match required careful analysis to ensure optimal outcomes, but the foundation had been established for a systematic conquest that would transform the Morvanti family from minor nobility into the dominant power in Italian politics. Luciana's performance during her mourning period continued to provide perfect cover for the intelligence operations that were already beginning to focus on Isabella's next targets. Her social activities, limited though they were by the conventions of widowhood, allowed her to gather information about the business practices, family dynamics, and personal vulnerabilities of the men who would soon find themselves receiving marriage proposals from the remaining Morvanti daughters. The pattern had been established, the methods proven effective, and the machinery of destruction was ready to be turned against new victims who would have no reason to suspect that their courtship of beautiful, accomplished young women was actually a death sentence disguised as romance. Isabella had demonstrated that marriage could indeed be transformed into murder, and the game that had claimed Marco Montecroce was ready to begin again with fresh players who would prove equally unprepared for the dangers that awaited them in the arms of the Morvanti daughter. The success of Luciana's mission had provided Isabella with more than just wealth and territory. It had given her absolute confidence in a strategy that could be refined and replicated across the Italian peninsula. As spring blossomed in Valdonia's gardens, she stood once again at her palazzo windows. But now her gaze swept across a city where her influence had begun to take root, like an invisible web stretching into every corner of power and commerce. The time had come to expand her operations beyond the single, careful elimination that had tested her methods. Now she would orchestrate a symphony of destruction that would claim 4 more great houses simultaneously. The intelligence network that Isabella had cultivated during Luciana's courtship and brief marriage had identified the perfect targets for her remaining daughters. Each family possessed specific strengths that would complement her growing empire, while exhibiting particular vulnerabilities that matched her daughter's specialized talents. More importantly, the timing was perfect. All 4 families had eligible sons of appropriate age, and none had yet detected the pattern that connected Marco Montecroce's mysterious death to the beautiful widow who had inherited his fortune. Bianca would be matched against the Della Torre family, whose control of the region's most effective mercenary companies made them both valuable allies and dangerous enemies. Their eldest son, Alessandro Della Torre, was 24 years old and known for his military brilliance, but also for an arrogance that made him susceptible to the particular form of intellectual seduction that Bianca had perfected. She would approach him not as a fragile beauty seeking protection, but as an artistic soul who appreciated the strategic mind behind his battlefield victories. Her weapons would be admiration, creative inspiration, and the gradual introduction of exotic substances, disguised as artistic materials. Valentina's target would be the Rosselli family, whose marriage connections to papal nobility provided access to the Vatican's political machinery and vast financial resources. The heir, Cardinal Lorenzo Rosselli's nephew Paolo, was a man of refined tastes and scholarly inclinations, whose weakness lay in his desire to be seen as a patron of learning and culture. Valentina would present herself as a brilliant student of classical literature and philosophy, creating an intellectual intimacy that would give her access to his private chambers and personal routines. Her method would involve manuscripts treated with substances that would absorb through the skin during his private study sessions. Serafina would focus on the Grimaldi banking family, whose financial networks stretched across Europe and whose cooperation was essential for any serious attempt at consolidating power in the Italian peninsula. Their son Roberto Grimaldi was known for his compassionate nature and his dedication to charitable works, qualities that made him perfectly suited to Serafina's particular talent for appearing as a vulnerable beauty in need of guidance and protection. She would present herself as a young woman struggling with spiritual questions and family pressures, drawing him into a relationship where his desire to help her would provide opportunities for the slow poisoning that would claim his life. The youngest daughter, Caterina, would be matched against the Firenze family, whose vast agricultural holdings fed much of northern Italy, and whose political connections could provide the rural power base that Isabella needed to complement her urban influence. Their heir, Giovanni Firenze, was barely 21 and known for his romantic nature and his susceptibility to beautiful women. Caterina, despite being only 16, possessed an almost supernatural ability to make older men feel protective while actually manipulating them completely. Her approach would be the most direct, relying on passionate romance to mask the administration of toxins that would appear to be the result of a weak heart overwhelmed by the intensity of new love. The coordination required to manage 4 simultaneous courtships while maintaining the operational security necessary to avoid detection challenged even as Isabella's considerable organizational abilities. Each daughter required individualized preparation, specialized equipment, and careful monitoring to ensure that their activities did not interfere with each other or create patterns that might alert potential victims to their danger. The timing had to be perfect too fast, and suspicions might be aroused too slow, and opportunities might be lost as target families made alternative arrangements for their sons' futures. Isabella established a command structure within her palazzo that functioned like a military headquarters, with Marco Santini coordinating intelligence gathering, while specialized servants managed the logistics of maintaining 4 separate deception operations. Secret chambers were prepared for storing the various toxins, documents, and equipment that each mission required, while communication systems were developed to allow secure coordination between the daughters as their campaigns progressed through different phases. The initial approaches were staggered across several months to avoid the appearance of systematic activity. Bianca's introduction to Alessandro della Torre was arranged through an exhibition of military artwork that she had supposedly created to honor the great commanders of Italian history. Her paintings demonstrated not only artistic talent but detailed knowledge of battlefield tactics and strategic principles that impressed Alessandro, while actually serving as evidence of the intelligence gathering that had preceded their meeting. Valentina's first contact with Paolo Rosselli occurred at a scholarly debate held at the University of Valdonia, where she presented a paper on classical rhetoric that showcased erudition far beyond what most men expected from women of her generation. Her arguments were brilliant, her citations extensive, and her presence so compelling that Paolo found himself drawn into discussions that continued long after the formal proceedings had concluded. Their subsequent correspondence appeared to focus on intellectual matters while actually serving Valentina's intelligence-gathering requirements and Paolo's gradual conditioning for the toxins that would eventually claim his life. Serafina's approach to Roberto Grimaldi began with a carefully orchestrated encounter at a charitable event, where she appeared to faint from the emotional impact of seeing poverty and suffering for the first time. Roberto's instinctive response was to offer assistance and comfort to the apparently delicate young woman whose sensitivity seemed to reflect a pure soul overwhelmed by the world's cruelty. Their subsequent meetings, ostensibly focused on his guidance of her charitable interests, provided opportunities for the psychological manipulation and chemical preparation that her mission required. Caterina's courtship of Giovanni Firenze was the most straightforward, relying on the immediate attraction that her extraordinary beauty inspired in the young heir. Their romance developed with the passion typical of youth, progressing quickly through stages of infatuation, devotion, and complete emotional dependency that made Giovanni eager to spend every possible moment in her company. What he interpreted as the overwhelming power of true love was actually the result of carefully administered substances that heightened emotional responses, while simultaneously weakening his physical resistance to the more lethal toxins that would follow. As summer progressed into autumn, all 4 courtships advanced according to Isabella's carefully coordinated timeline. The intelligence reports she received from her daughters confirmed that each target was developing the emotional attachments and behavioral patterns that their eventual elimination would require. More important, none of the target families had detected any connection between their son's new romantic interests and the tragic death of Marco Montecroce, whose widow continued to be viewed as a sympathetic figure whose presence at social events added an element of romantic tragedy that made other young women seem pale by comparison. The engagement announcements came in rapid succession during the winter months, creating a social season that buzzed with excitement about the romantic fortunes of the Morvanti daughters. 4 of Valdonia's most eligible bachelors had been claimed by women whose beauty, intelligence, and accomplishments made them the envy of noble families throughout the peninsula. The coincidence of so many advantageous matches within a single family was attributed to Isabella's excellent training of her daughters and her strategic cultivation of relationships that had created opportunities for her girls to meet suitable partners. The wedding preparations provided Isabella with unprecedented access to the internal operations of 4 major families simultaneously. Under the pretense of coordinating between households, she gained detailed knowledge of business practices, financial arrangements, political alliances, and personal relationships that would prove crucial during the elimination phase of her operation. Each family's vulnerabilities were mapped with military precision, their key personnel identified and assessed for loyalty or potential threat, and their assets cataloged for eventual transfer to Morvanti control. The weddings themselves were staggered across the spring season, each ceremony building upon lessons learned from the previous celebration, while avoiding the appearance of systematic planning. Isabella attended each wedding as the proud mother whose daughters had achieved remarkable success in securing advantageous marriages, but she was actually conducting final reconnaissance missions that would inform the specific methods by which each son-in-law would meet his carefully orchestrated death. Bianca's marriage to Alessandro della Torre was celebrated with military pageantry that honored the groom's martial accomplishments, while providing cover for the introduction of substances that would begin his physical conditioning for the toxins to come. The wedding feast featured exotic spices that Alessandro attributed to his new wife's sophisticated palate, not knowing that these same seasonings were systematically altering his body's chemistry in ways that would prove fatal within months. Valentina's wedding to Paolo Rosselli took place in the cathedral, with papal representatives blessing a union that appeared to strengthen ties between noble and clerical authority. The ceremony's religious significance provided perfect justification for the extensive use of incense and ceremonial substances that began Paolo's exposure to the rare minerals that would gradually accumulate in his system until they reached lethal concentration. Serafina's marriage to Roberto Grimaldi was marked by elaborate charitable donations that reflected the groom's philanthropic interests, while actually serving to establish financial mechanisms that would facilitate the transfer of his wealth following his death. The wedding gifts included artworks and decorative objects that had been treated with substances designed to release toxic vapors when exposed to heat, ensuring that Roberto's private chambers would become gradually more dangerous with each passing day. Caterina's marriage to Giovanni Fiorenze was celebrated with the passionate intensity appropriate to such young lovers, but the romantic atmosphere concealed the introduction of aphrodisiac compounds that would intensify Giovanni's physical responses while simultaneously weakening his cardiovascular system. His obvious happiness and vigorous health would make his eventual heart failure appear completely natural to physicians who had no reason to suspect poisoning. The honeymoon periods that followed each wedding allowed Isabella's daughters to complete their intelligence gathering while beginning the systematic poisoning that would claim their husbands' lives according to carefully coordinated schedules. Each method was designed to produce symptoms that would appear unrelated to the others, preventing the detection of patterns that might alert surviving family members to the true nature of their losses. Alessandro della Torre was the first to show signs of the mysterious illness that would claim his life, experiencing fatigue and concentration difficulties that gradually interfered with his military duties. His physicians attributed these symptoms to the stresses of command and the adjustments required by married life, recommending rest and dietary changes that actually accelerated the toxic processes already underway in his system. Bianca played the concerned wife perfectly, consulting with medical authorities and seeking treatments that appeared helpful while actually ensuring that her husband's condition would continue to deteriorate, according to her precise timeline. Paolo Rosselli's decline was more subtle, manifesting as scholarly absent-mindedness and physical weakness that seemed consistent with a life devoted to intellectual rather than physical pursuits. His extensive library provided perfect cover for Valentina's continued administration of toxic substances disguised as rare inks and manuscript preservation materials. His growing dependence on her assistance with his research created opportunities for intimate contact that allowed precise control over his exposure to the substances that were gradually destroying his internal organ. Roberto Grimaldi's symptoms appeared to be related to his charitable work, with physicians suggesting that his exposure to disease and poverty during his humanitarian activities had compromised his naturally robust constitution. Serafina's apparent distress at her husband's condition earned her widespread sympathy, while her dedicated nursing care actually ensured that he received regular doses of the toxins that were systematically shutting down his body's vital functions. Giovanni Fiorenza's deterioration was attributed to the passionate intensity of his marriage, with family members joking that young love had literally overwhelmed his heart. His episodes of chest pain and breathing difficulties were dismissed as the natural result of emotional excess, while Caterina's devoted attention during his increasingly frequent periods of weakness provided perfect opportunities for administering the final doses that would complete his destruction. The deaths occurred within a 6-month period, each apparently unrelated to the others, and all seeming to result from natural causes or understandable complications of existing conditions. Alessandro succumbed to what physicians termed a fever of unknown origin. Paolo died from complications related to kidney failure. Roberto's death was attributed to heart disease exacerbated by exhaustion from overwork, and Giovanni's demise was blamed on a congenital weakness that had been triggered by the excitement of his new marriage. Each funeral was attended by mourners who genuinely grieved for promising young men whose lives had been cut short by mysterious illnesses, and each widow received sympathy and support from communities that viewed them as innocent victims of cruel fate. The Morvanti daughters played their roles perfectly, demonstrating grief that appeared genuine while actually celebrating the successful completion of missions that had required months of careful preparation and flawless execution. The inheritance patterns that emerged from these deaths revealed the complete success of Isabella's strategy. Each daughter inherited vast wealth and extensive business interests from husbands who had died without producing heirs, creating concentrations of power that could be coordinated to serve Isabella's broader objectives. The 4 great families that had once competed with Morvanti interests were now effectively controlled by Isabella through her daughters' inherited positions, transforming potential enemies into subordinate elements of her expanding empire. More importantly, the simultaneous elimination of 4 major rivals had created a power vacuum that Isabella was perfectly positioned to fill through the resources she now controlled. Trade routes, military contracts, financial networks, and political alliances that had previously been distributed among competing interests were now unified under her direction, providing the foundation for influence that extended far beyond Valdonia's traditional boundaries. The success of the coordinated campaign exceeded even Isabella's ambitious projections, confirming her belief that systematic marriage-based assassination could be used to restructure the entire Italian political landscape. The methods had been proven effective on a scale that eliminated any doubt about their potential for even larger applications. While the complete lack of suspicion from surviving family members demonstrated that the operational security measures were adequate for indefinitely expanded operations. As autumn returned to Valdonia, Isabella stood once again at her palazzo windows. But now her view encompassed a city and region where her influence had become the dominant force shaping political and economic decisions. The four great houses that had once challenged Morvanti authority were now essentially subsidiaries of her growing empire, their resources and connections serving her objectives, while their traditional names provided useful cover for activities that might attract unwanted attention if directly associated with her family. The success of the 5 eliminations, Marco Montecroce, followed by the 4 simultaneous targets, had established the foundation for Isabella's ultimate objective: the transformation of her family from regional nobility into the dominant power in Italian politics. The methods had been tested and refined, the infrastructure was in place for larger operations, and the next phase would target even more ambitious goals that would reshape the balance of power throughout the peninsula. The chain of deaths that had claimed 5 of Italy's most promising young men had been forged by a woman whose strategic vision exceeded anything previously seen in the complex world of Renaissance politics. Isabella Morvanti had proven that power belonged to those clever enough to seize it through methods that left no evidence of their true nature. And her daughters had demonstrated that beauty and intelligence could be more devastating than any army when wielded by minds trained in the arts of deception and destruction. 5 years after the first letter had arrived at the Montecroce Palazzo, Isabella Morvanti stood at the pinnacle of power that few rulers in history had ever achieved. She commanded the resources of 6 great houses, controlled trade routes that spanned the Mediterranean, and wielded influence that reached into the Vatican itself, all without ever holding an official title or commanding a single soldier. Her empire was built not on conquest, but on carefully orchestrated widowhood, and her daughters had become the most powerful women in Italy through methods that left no evidence of wrongdoing. The transformation of the Italian political landscape had been so gradual and seemingly natural that even the most astute observers failed to recognize the systematic nature of Isabella's achievement. Where once 5 competing families had maintained the delicate balance of power that characterized Renaissance politics, now their combined resources flowed through channels that Isabella controlled with absolute authority. The Montecroce trading networks, the Della Torre military contracts, the Rosselli ecclesiastical connections, the Grimaldi banking systems, and the Firenze agricultural wealth had been seamlessly integrated into a single economic and political machine that operated under Isabella's strategic direction. From her command center within the Morvanti Palazzo, Isabella coordinated activities that influenced decisions in Rome, Venice, Florence, and Naples. Her intelligence network had grown to include informants in papal offices, commercial guilds, military organizations, and noble households throughout the peninsula. Information flowed to her from sources who had no idea they were serving a single master intelligence, while her directives reached implementation through channels so diverse and apparently independent that even the most paranoid targets never suspected the existence of unified opposition to their interests. Her daughters had evolved from accomplished young women into formidable political operators whose influence extended far beyond what their official positions might suggest. Luciana, now 29 and controlling the vast Montecroce commercial empire, had established herself as one of the most respected business leaders in northern Italy. Her reputation for shrewd negotiation and ethical conduct masked her role as Isabella's primary intelligence coordinator, responsible for gathering information about potential threats and opportunities throughout the trading communities that formed the backbone of Italian prosperity. Bianca, at 27, had inherited Alessandro della Torre's military connections and transformed them into a private intelligence service that rivaled the official networks maintained by major powers. Her artistic talents provided perfect cover for travel throughout Italy and beyond, as commissions for portraits and historical paintings took her into the private chambers and secret councils of the most powerful individuals in European politics. Her sketches captured more than physical likenesses. They documented the defensive preparations, family relationships, and personal habits that would prove crucial if these individuals ever became targets for elimination. 25-year-old Valentina had parlayed her inheritance of Paolo Rosselli's ecclesiastical connections into unprecedented access to Vatican decision-making processes. Her reputation as a scholarly widow devoted to theological study and charitable works allowed her to maintain apartments in Rome while coordinating with church officials whose policies affected political developments throughout Catholic Europe. Her intellectual discussions with cardinals and papal advisors provided intelligence about religious politics while positioning her to influence decisions that could make or break secular rulers who depended on church support. Serafina, now 23, had inherited Roberto Grimaldi's banking network and expanded it into a financial intelligence operation that monitored the cash flows and credit arrangements that determined the fate of governments and commercial enterprises throughout Europe. Her apparent grief over her late husband's philanthropic concerns provided cover for financial activities that could support allies or destroy enemies through carefully orchestrated economic pressure. Her charitable donations created obligations and dependencies that could be activated when political circumstances required coordinated action. The youngest daughter, Caterina, had proven most remarkable in her adaptation to power. At just 21, she had transformed Giovanni Fiorenzi's agricultural holdings into a comprehensive rural intelligence network that monitored political developments in regions that urban-focused organizations typically ignored. Her youth and beauty attracted confidences from rural nobles and local officials who underestimated her capabilities, while providing information about military movements, harvest conditions, and popular sentiment that often proved more valuable than intelligence gathered through traditional diplomatic channels. The palazzo that served as headquarters for this unprecedented empire had been extensively modified to accommodate the communications and coordination requirements that Isabella's operations demanded. Hidden chambers contained maps, documents, and correspondence related to ongoing activities throughout Europe, while secret passages allowed secure movement of personnel and materials without attracting attention from the servants and visitors who moved through the public areas of the residence. The garden where the sisters had once played innocent games now concealed meeting spaces and storage facilities that supported intelligence operations spanning multiple kingdoms. Isabella's daily routine had evolved to match the complexity of her responsibilities, beginning before dawn with reports from her daughters and continuing through carefully scheduled meetings with agents, allies, and targets who had no idea they were contributing to a unified strategic plan. Her public role as the respected widow of a minor count provided perfect cover for activities that would have attracted immediate attention if conducted by someone with obvious political ambitions. She attended social events, supported charitable causes, and maintained friendships with other noble ladies while actually directing operations that influenced the fate of kingdoms. The financial resources at Isabella's disposal had grown beyond anything she had imagined during the early planning stages of her campaign. The combined wealth of the 6 families now under her control included liquid assets, property holdings, business investments, and credit arrangements that made her one of the richest individuals in Europe. More importantly, these resources were distributed through apparently independent channels that prevented anyone from recognizing the concentration of economic power that had developed under her guidance. This wealth provided the foundation for Isabella's expanding influence, funding intelligence operations, supporting political allies, and purchasing cooperation from individuals whose assistance proved necessary for specific objectives. She could finance military campaigns, subsidize favorable trade agreements, or destroy hostile commercial enterprises through methods that appeared to result from normal market forces rather than coordinated manipulation. Her economic power was invisible but decisive, shaping political developments without leaving traces that could be connected to her family's activities. The military capabilities that Isabella commanded through her daughter's connections had evolved into a network of mercenary companies, private guards and loyal retainers who could be activated for operations ranging from discreet assassinations to large-scale military campaigns. These forces were nominally independent and served various official masters, but their actual loyalty belonged to Isabella through financial arrangements and personal obligations that ensured their availability when circumstances required decisive action. Alessandro della Torre's former military associates had been gradually integrated into this network through Bianca's management of their contracts and equipment needs. Their expertise in warfare and intelligence operations provided capabilities that complemented the more subtle methods that had established Isabella's initial power base. When diplomacy and manipulation proved insufficient, these resources could provide the force necessary to eliminate obstacles or protect assets that were essential to her continued operation. The intelligence network that had begun as a necessity for protecting her daughters during their marriage campaigns had expanded into a comprehensive monitoring system that tracked political developments, commercial opportunities, and potential threats throughout Italy and beyond. Information flowed to Isabella from sources in every major city, while her analyses and directives reached implementation through channels that ensured coordinated responses to developments that could affect her interests. This intelligence apparatus had proven its value repeatedly by providing advance warning of threats that might have disrupted her operations, or revealing opportunities that could be exploited for further expansion. When the King of Naples considered policies that might have interfered with trade routes under Morvanti control, Isabella received advance notice that allowed her to organize opposition through seemingly independent commercial interests. When the Pope contemplated ecclesiastical appointments that might have limited Valentina's access to Vatican decision-making, information about alternative candidates reached the appropriate officials through channels that appeared unrelated to Morvanti interests. The scope of Isabella's achievement became apparent when she reviewed the comprehensive status reports that her daughters provided during their monthly coordination meetings. The resources under her control included shipping fleets that carried cargo throughout the Mediterranean, mining operations that supplied strategic materials to manufacturers across Europe, banking facilities that financed commercial ventures and political activities from London to Constantinople, and agricultural estates that fed major population centers while generating the surplus wealth that supported her expanding activities. More significantly, the political influence that had grown from her systematic elimination of rival families now extended into virtually every center of power that mattered for Italian politics. She could influence papal decisions through Valentina's ecclesiastical connections, shape military policies through Bianca's relationship with mercenary commanders, affect commercial regulations through Luciana's position in trading guilds, manipulate financial markets through Serafina's banking networks, and monitor rural political developments through Caterina's agricultural contacts. This unprecedented concentration of power had been achieved through methods that left no evidence of coordination or systematic planning. To outside observers, the Morvanti family appeared to have been remarkably fortunate in their daughters' marriages and tragically unfortunate in the early deaths of their sons-in-law. The subsequent success of the widowed daughters seemed to result from their natural talents and their inherited advantages rather than any coordinated strategy for achieving dominance over their former rivals. The camouflage was so perfect that even Isabella's most direct competitors failed to recognize the true nature of the threat they faced. Families who might have united to oppose a single powerful adversary instead found themselves dealing with apparently independent commercial rivals, political opponents, and economic competitors whose activities seemed unrelated despite their cumulative impact on traditional power structures. By the time any patterns became apparent, Isabella's position had become so well established that direct opposition would have been both dangerous and futile. The 5th anniversary of Marco Montecroce's death provided Isabella with an opportunity to assess the comprehensive success of her strategic vision. The young man whose marriage to Luciana had initiated her campaign had been the first link in a chain of eliminations that had transformed the political landscape of Italy. While establishing her family as the dominant force in Renaissance power politics, his death had been mourned as a tragedy, but it had actually marked the beginning of a new era in which traditional noble families would serve as subordinate elements in an empire built on deception, manipulation, and carefully orchestrated elimination of obstacles to absolute power. Standing in her private study, surrounded by maps that documented the extent of her influence and correspondence that confirmed her control over resources spanning multiple kingdoms, Isabella experienced the profound satisfaction that comes from achieving objectives that had once seemed impossibly ambitious. She had proven that intelligence, patience, and careful planning could accomplish what traditional methods of conquest had failed to achieve throughout centuries of European warfare and diplomacy. Her daughter's transformation from accomplice to autonomous operators had exceeded her most optimistic projections, demonstrating capabilities that suggested the potential for even greater achievements in future campaigns. Each had developed specialized expertise that complemented the others, while maintaining the operational security that protected their collective activities from detection by potential opponents. Their success proved that the methods Isabella had pioneered could be taught, refined, and applied on scales that might ultimately reshape the entire European political system. The next phase of Isabella's plans would test whether the empire she had built through marriage and murder could be extended beyond Italy's boundaries to influence the broader balance of power that determined the fate of European civilization. The foundations were in place, the methods had been proven effective, and the resources were available for campaigns that would dwarf the elimination of 5 Italian noble families in their scope and significance. As evening descended over Valdonia, Isabella began reviewing the intelligence reports that would inform her decisions about expansion into territories where her daughter's beauty and her own strategic brilliance might prove capable of achievements that would establish the Morvanti name among the great powers of European history. The empire was at its peak, but Isabella understood that power unused was power wasted, and the time had come to discover whether her methods could transform regional dominance into continental supremacy. The widows who controlled 6 great fortunes were ready for challenges that would test their abilities against opponents whose resources and experience far exceeded anything they had previously encountered. The game that had begun with a single marriage proposal was about to expand into dimensions that would determine whether Isabella Morvanti would be remembered as a regional success or as the architect of a new form of empire that redefined the very nature of political power in the Renaissance world. 25 years had passed since Isabella Morvanti first gazed from her palazzo windows and conceived the audacious plan that would transform her family from minor nobility into the secret rulers of Italy. Now, at 57, she stood at the same window, but the view that greeted her eyes encompassed an empire that stretched far beyond the boundaries of any traditional kingdom. Her silver-streaked hair was arranged with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized every aspect of her rise to power, and her dark eyes still held the calculating intelligence that had made her the most dangerous woman in Europe. The palazzo itself had been transformed into something resembling a royal court, though its inhabitants held no official titles and its influence was never acknowledged in the diplomatic correspondence that flowed between recognized monarchs. Representatives from across Europe sought audiences with the Contessa, ostensibly to discuss commercial arrangements or cultural exchanges, but actually to negotiate with the woman whose approval could determine the success or failure of their political ambitions. Cardinals consulted her about ecclesiastical appointments. Merchants sought her blessing for trading ventures, and military commanders requested her support for campaigns that would reshape the balance of continental power. Her daughters, now mature women in their own right, had evolved into something unprecedented in European politics: a ruling council of widows, whose combined influence exceeded that of most crowned heads. Luciana, at 49, commanded commercial networks that could strangle the economy of any European city within months. Bianca's military intelligence operations at 47 had grown to rival the official intelligence services of major powers. Valentina, 45, could influence papal policy through connections that extended to the highest levels of church hierarchy. Serafina's banking empire at 43 controlled credit and currency flows that determined the fate of kingdoms, and Caterina, the youngest at 41, had transformed her agricultural holdings into a rural intelligence network that monitored political developments across a continent. The methods that had claimed 5 Italian husbands had been refined and expanded over the decades, claiming targets throughout Europe as Isabella's ambitions grew to match her capabilities. The technique of marriage-based assassination had proven effective against French nobles, German princes, and Spanish grandees who made the fatal mistake of pursuing relationships with women connected to Isabella's expanding network of agents and allies. Each elimination had been carefully orchestrated to appear natural while serving Isabella's strategic objectives, creating a pattern of mysterious deaths that some scholars would eventually recognize as one of the most successful assassination campaigns in European history. The scope of these operations had required the development of an organizational structure that functioned like a shadow government, complete with specialized departments for intelligence gathering, financial manipulation, military operations, and diplomatic influence. Isabella's headquarters staff included linguists who could forge documents in any European language, chemists who developed untraceable toxins, and strategists who planned operations with the precision of military campaigns. The palazzo's hidden chambers contained archives that documented the weaknesses, relationships, and elimination methods for hundreds of European nobility, creating a comprehensive database that could be consulted whenever circumstances required the removal of obstacles to Isabella's objective. The financial resources at Isabella's disposal had grown beyond calculation, encompassing not only the inherited wealth of her daughter's deceased husbands, but also the profits from decades of commercial manipulation, political influence peddling, and strategic investment in ventures that served her long-term goals. She could finance the construction of entire cities, subsidize the military campaigns of allied rulers, or crash the economies of hostile territories through coordinated market manipulation that appeared to result from natural commercial forces rather than deliberate sabotage. This economic power provided the foundation for political influence that extended into every European capital, allowing Isabella to shape policy decisions, determine diplomatic appointments, and influence military strategies through methods that left no traces of her involvement. Kings and emperors who believed they were making independent decisions were actually implementing policies that served Isabella's objectives, their choices guided by information, incentives, and pressures that originated from sources they never suspected. The intelligence network that had begun as protection for her daughter's marriage campaigns had evolved into a comprehensive monitoring system that tracked political developments, commercial opportunities, and potential threats throughout Europe and beyond. Her agents operated in London, Paris, Vienna, Madrid, and dozens of smaller cities, providing information about government policies, military preparations, and personal scandals that could be exploited for strategic advantage. The coordination of this network required communication systems that rivaled those of major powers, with encrypted correspondence flowing between operatives who often had no idea they were serving a unified command structure. Isabella's influence over religious affairs had grown through Valentina's patient cultivation of relationships within the Vatican hierarchy, creating opportunities to shape papal policy in ways that served her broader objectives. She could influence the appointment of bishops, the approval of religious orders, and the allocation of church resources through methods that appeared to result from theological considerations rather than political manipulation. Her ability to promise or threaten ecclesiastical advancement had proven decisive in recruiting cooperation from ambitious clerics throughout Catholic Europe. The military capabilities under Isabella's control had expanded far beyond the mercenary companies inherited from her daughter's marriages, encompassing private armies, intelligence operatives, and specialized assassination teams that could be deployed anywhere in Europe within weeks of receiving orders. These forces were nominally independent and served various official masters, but their actual loyalty belonged to Isabella through financial arrangements and personal obligations that ensured their availability when circumstances required decisive action. The most remarkable aspect of Isabella's achievement was that it remained virtually invisible to the official power structures that dominated European politics. She held no recognized titles, claimed no territories, and appeared in no diplomatic protocols. Yet her approval was essential for any major political development in Italy, and increasingly influential in decisions made throughout the continent. Her empire existed in the shadows of legitimate government, exercising power through methods that left no evidence of coordination or systematic planning. This invisibility had been maintained through careful attention to operational security that surpassed anything attempted by traditional intelligence services. Isabella's agents often operated without knowing the identity of their ultimate employer, receiving orders through intermediaries who themselves had no direct contact with the Palazzo command structure. Financial transactions were routed through networks of banks and commercial enterprises that obscured the source of funding, while communication was conducted through codes and channels that would take years to decipher even if discovered by hostile intelligence services. The 25th anniversary of Marco Montecroce's death had passed without public acknowledgement, but Isabella marked the occasion with private satisfaction at the completeness of her strategic success. The young man whose elimination had initiated her campaign would never have imagined that his death would provide the foundation for an empire that influenced the fate of European civilization. His marriage to Luciana had been mourned as a romantic tragedy, but it had actually marked the beginning of a new era in which traditional concepts of royal authority would be supplemented by forms of power that operated beyond the recognition of conventional political analysis. The challenges that had tested Isabella's methods over the decades had only strengthened her confidence in the superiority of her approach to traditional conquest. Military campaigns required vast resources, produced uncertain outcomes, and created lasting enmities that complicated future operations. Diplomatic negotiations were limited by the need to provide reciprocal benefits and could be disrupted by changes in government or policy. But marriage-based assassination combined maximum effectiveness with minimum visibility, eliminating obstacles while creating inheritance relationships that provided permanent access to target resources. The success of her methods had inspired Isabella to develop training programs that could prepare future generations to continue and expand her work. Selected young women throughout her network received education in the arts of seduction, intelligence gathering, and discreet elimination that would allow them to carry forward the traditions that had proven so effective. These protégés were carefully chosen for intelligence, beauty, and psychological suitability for operations that required intimate betrayal of trust, ensuring that Isabella's techniques would survive her own eventual death. The scope of Isabella's current operations extended far beyond the elimination of individual targets to encompass systematic influence over the fundamental structures that determined European political development. She could shape the selection of royal advisors, influence the negotiation of international treaties, and determine the outcome of succession disputes through methods that appeared to result from natural political processes rather than external manipulation. Her power had become structural rather than merely personal, embedded in systems that would continue to serve her objectives regardless of changes in specific leadership. The next phase of Isabella's plans involved expansion beyond Europe to encompass global opportunities that were emerging as exploration and colonial development created new centers of wealth and influence. Her commercial networks already extended into North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, while her intelligence operations had begun gathering information about developments in the Americas that might provide opportunities for strategic investment or political manipulation. The methods that had proven effective in European contexts might require adaptation for different cultural settings, but the fundamental principles of marriage-based acquisition remained universally applicable. Isabella's assessment of her current position revealed capabilities that exceeded those of most recognized monarchs, combined with operational security that made her virtually invulnerable to conventional forms of opposition. She commanded resources that could finance military campaigns, influence religious policy, manipulate commercial markets, and eliminate individual obstacles with equal effectiveness. Her intelligence networks provided early warning of threats, while identifying opportunities for expansion, and her daughter's specialized expertise had created redundant capabilities that could maintain operations even if individual elements were compromised. The prospect of expanding her empire to global dimensions required careful consideration of the additional complexity that such operations would entail. Communication delays, cultural differences, and unfamiliar political structures would create challenges that had not existed within the relatively familiar environment of European politics. However, the fundamental advantages that had enabled Isabella's success, superior intelligence, patient planning, and methods that left no evidence of systematic coordination, would remain effective regardless of geographic or cultural context. As Isabella reviewed the comprehensive reports that documented her current position and future opportunities, she experienced the profound satisfaction that comes from achieving objectives that had once seemed impossibly ambitious. She had proven that intelligence, patience, and systematic elimination of obstacles could accomplish what traditional methods of conquest had failed to achieve throughout centuries of European warfare and diplomacy. Her empire was built not on territorial control, but on influence and fear, making it more resilient than conventional kingdoms while remaining invisible to potential opponents. The evolution of her daughters from accomplices to autonomous operators had created a leadership structure that could continue Isabella's work even after her own death, ensuring that the Morvanti name would influence European politics for generations to come. Each daughter had developed capabilities that exceeded Isabella's own expertise in specific areas, while maintaining the coordination and security consciousness that protected their collective activities from detection by potential enemies. The legacy that Isabella would leave extended far beyond the personal success of her family to encompass fundamental changes in the nature of political power that would influence European development for centuries. She had demonstrated that traditional concepts of authority based on inheritance, military force, or divine mandate could be supplemented by forms of influence that operated through commercial relationships, personal loyalty, and the systematic elimination of opposition. Her methods had proven that power could be acquired and maintained through means that left no traces for historical analysis, creating precedents that would inspire imitators and revolutionize the conduct of international relations. Standing at her palazzo window as evening descended over Valdonia, Isabella gazed out at a city and continent where her influence had become the invisible force that shaped political development and determined the fate of kingdoms. The young widow who had once feared for her family's survival had become the secret empress of Europe, her power exercised through methods that would never be fully understood by the historians who would chronicle the period's events. The marriage proposals that had initiated her campaign had evolved into a comprehensive system for acquiring and maintaining power that redefined the very nature of political authority in the Renaissance world. The Morvanti Empire would continue to grow and adapt, its methods refined by experience and its scope expanded by opportunity. Isabella had created something unprecedented in European history, a form of government that operated in the shadows of legitimate authority, while exercising influence that exceeded that of recognized monarchs. Her daughters would carry forward this legacy, applying lessons learned through decades of successful operations to challenges and opportunities that would test the limits of what could be achieved through intelligence, patience, and the systematic elimination of obstacles to absolute power. As the candles were lit throughout the palazzo and the business of empire continued through the night hours, Isabella Morvanti smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had achieved everything she had ever dared to imagine. She had proven that a woman's intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle, that careful planning could accomplish what brute force had failed to achieve, and that the greatest empires were those that remained invisible to their subjects. The queen, who would never wear a crown, had become more powerful than any monarch in European history, and her reign would continue long after the deaths of the kings and emperors who believed themselves to be the continent's true rulers. The Morvanti matriarch had achieved immortality not through monuments or official recognition, but through the creation of systems and methods that would influence European politics for generations to come. Her empire would outlast those built on conquest and inheritance, sustained by the enduring effectiveness of techniques that combined maximum impact with complete invisibility. Isabella had written her name in the shadows of history, where it would remain forever as a testament to the power of intelligence over force, patience over haste, and systematic planning over random violence. The game that had begun with a single letter was complete. but its consequences would echo through European history long after the last of Isabella's enemies had been eliminated and the final phase of her continental dominance had been achieved. The Morvanti name would be whispered in the corridors of power for centuries, a reminder that the most dangerous opponents were those whose very existence remained hidden from their victims until the moment of their ultimate triumph.